Outside City Hall, I'm talking to Andy Worthington, who is a journalist who's been specialising in housing development in London in particular over the last few years. So Andy, you were at the evictions at Tidemill Gardens on Monday of this week. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and what your impressions on that day were?
Well, it was horrendous violence on Monday, actually. I mean, the bailiffs came in at 6 o'clock with some really heavy-duty people who cut through the fence and stormed through, terrorising the site and getting rid of everybody apart from one young woman who managed to climb up a tree and stayed there for about 8 hours, which ultimately is what delayed them from shutting down the whole garden within a few hours, actually. But I can't see any way that the council thinks that they can spin that violence into something positive. I mean, there are local residents, you know, in the flats just by the front gate of the garden, who were woken up at 6 o'clock by people screaming. They heard somebody shouting "help, help, help" from the garden. These were not people who I knew were particularly involved in the campaign and the occupation of the last 2 months. But suddenly, on their doorstep, this stuff's happening, and they're all, you know, really deeply shocked by it. So I think a really heavy-handed and disproportionate response, when all that we've ever been asking for them to do is not to stop their development, but to adjust what they're trying to do to spare this precious garden, and also not to destroy the 16 structurally sound council flats of Reginald House next door. Because when you've got a plan to destroy council flats that there's nothing wrong with, then it begs the question, what are you doing that for? And they're obviously doing that because they want to replace it with new housing that is set up on a different basis, even though they're calling it social housing.
So there were over 130 bailiffs and security there. I understand one woman was pushed to the floor and that she's now reported that to police. Now the councillors, Joe Dromey and Paul Bell, promised to investigate any incident of assault. How do you think the protesters will react to that offer?
Well, I mean, I suppose if they are actually going to proceed with it and it leads to something, then that's the appropriate thing to do. But what it ignores is the fact that it was Lewisham Council who set up the whole of this thing in the first place. So, you know, it's effectively a bit of a PR job on Joe Dromey's part, I think.
Okay. What do you make of the much vaunted 108 social housing units that the supporters of this scheme, they talk about it all the time?
So what we have on the Tidemill site is, I think it's 104 homes. The other figure that they use is 117, but they're knocking down 13 existing council flats as part of the planned demolition of Reginald House. What they're not really flagging up is that although they call them social homes, although they call the rents affordable rents, these are not the existing rents that, for example, the people in Reginald House have, who are on social rents, which is what people get in council properties and in housing association properties. Or certainly those people who have existing tenancies from before the Tories came in and changed the system. So the 104 homes that they say they're going to build on the Tidemill site aren't social rents. They're at London affordable rent, which is the new rate that has been set by Sadiq Khan, which, if you generally look at how it's reported in the media, they say it's 20 or 30% higher. In Lewisham, according to the council's own statistics, it's 63% higher. So you're looking at over £3,000 extra a year for hard-working families, and you know, I'm sure people can realise that a lot of people don't have an extra 60 quid a week to spare at the end of the week. They don't have an extra £3,000 to pay per year. And I think what's really worrying about the introduction of London affordable rent is that stealthily across London and coming from City Hall is this idea that this is going to be the new bottom line of rentals. And I think everybody needs to be actually quite concerned about what that says about existing social housing at social rents, because I think it means that nobody is safe. Just like the people in Reginald House, nobody is safe because they want to do away with social rents. So that's definitely something that people should be concerned about. But what's also important about the Tidemill site is that when planning permission went through for that, it was stealthily twinned with Amersham Vale in New Cross. So that's the old site of Deptford Green School. It's also Peabody. So the two projects are actually combined, but you won't see that by going to the council's website where it's barely mentioned. On Amersham Vale, Peabody is building 120 new homes and 81 of those are for private sale. So when you hear councillors talk about how the number of social homes or the number of affordable homes on Tidemill, it's going to be over 50%, and they're trumpeting this as the first time in a generation that this many new social homes are being built. They're neglecting to mention that there is a very small percentage of new social homes being built at Amersham Vale. It's actually just 20% of that development.
So the existing tenants who are being have to move out of Reginald House when it's demolished, they're being promised no rent increases. Incoming tenants, the new inhabitants of the social housing, are being promised a London affordable rent, but they're being promised tenancies for life. Now, when I've asked further about this, I found that the councillor's Dromi hasn't been able to verify exactly what that means, but he has told me that he believes it's in the contract between the developer and Lewisham Council, and therefore is legally enforceable. But my further investigation into that found that, in fact, if it's a matter of a contract between the developer and the council, that will not give any legal recourse to the tenants because they're not part of that contract.
Right. Well, I think, yeah.
So tell us about that.
Well, I mean, as I understand it, there isn't the legislative framework to actually offer the kind of secure lifetime tenancies that they're claiming, because they don't exist anymore. Now, you know, if you pay your rent under the kind of secure or assured tenancy that people are actually going to get, then you can live there as long as, you know, as long as you're alive. But to claim that there is some legislative basis for protecting people's tenancies for life, I think is untrue. And I also think that it's worth mentioning that because they have gone out of their way so much to say that the tenants in Reginald House who are moved into the new housing will have their existing rents guaranteed for life, we haven't seen that in a written contract anywhere. Maybe this is what they're genuinely offering because they're so desperate to appease criticism. But I have to say that that then takes us back to the issues that are raised by the residents of Reginald House, who don't want to move out of their homes but haven't been balloted by the council, but 80% of them have said they want to stay in letters that they've delivered to the council and to the GLA. If you're going to offer them like for life, why bother knocking their homes down in the first place? And there's no answer forthcoming from the council about that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Tidemill Gardens. The cabinet member Paul Bell said in an interview on radio that yes, it's a nice little park, but it's not Kew Gardens. Do you think he's basically exhibiting a lack of understanding of the ecological importance and the habitat that has been created there, not just for people but for animals and so on? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
What's your response to that? I mean, what makes Tidemill more than just another green space?
Well, it's very condescending, isn't it? And I mean, in another interview he said they weren't the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as well, which was even more far-fetched. No, it's a small community garden but with a very, very important role on two fronts in Deptford. First of all, it's a community space, a green community space, a green oasis, somewhere that people can go to get away from the pressures of the world in a part of Deptford where there isn't any other green space like it. But also it's important, the environmental power of this site. So the tree canopy that has been built up over the 20 years that the garden has existed is mitigating some of the worst effects of the pollution on nearby Deptford Church Street, where particulate levels have been regularly recorded that are 6 times the recommended safety limits of the World Health Organization. Now, the council tends to sidestep any of these difficult discussions by saying that they're going to replace it with more green space, all of this. That doesn't matter. When you cut down those trees that are actively now doing such a great job to protect people from this horrendous pollution, that protection from the pollution is gone. Pollution levels increase. Who cares that many, many years down the line their new plantings are going to have some kind of effect? It's a disastrous thing to do environmentally at the moment, and they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with that at all.
So, Andy, I believe there's still an appeal going through the court process, even though this eviction seems to have taken place regardless.
Yeah, it's quite shocking, isn't it? So we crowdfunded an application for a judicial review over the summer, and that was turned down on first glance by the judge. So then we applied for a proper oral hearing, and that took place on October the 17th, and the judge involved turned it down. But we then launched an appeal to the Court of Appeals, which is ongoing. And we told the council, you know, we really don't think that it's appropriate for you to forcibly take back your garden while there is a legal process ongoing, and they completely ignored us. You know, I think by any measure that surely counts as a black mark against them. And I can't provide any verification for a claim that I've heard that they have said that they won't actually physically destroy the garden until the legal process is complete. But they could have left the occupation in place, because now they're in this ridiculous situation where the garden looks like a war zone. It's protected by bailiffs who look like an invading army.
Which is very expensive.
Which is very expensive. It's not winning hearts and minds in Deptford, and this looks like this could go on for months.
Yeah. So we're standing here, and there's a rally going on not far from here, which is a protest about the gentrification of estates across London, the social cleansing that is seen to go with that, and the fact that Sadiq Khan has apparently nodded through a lot of development applications without ballots for the existing residents. Some of these very well known, like Cressingham Gardens.
Yeah.
Could you just say a little bit about that context?
Yeah, sure. So this was a rally to bring together representatives of around 36 estates whose destruction was approved by Sadiq Khan without them getting the ballots. That of course Jeremy Corbyn last autumn promised would be Labour policy, that you can't destroy an estate without balloting the residents. So clearly they're representatives of councils who had plans that were underway, had a word with Sadiq Khan so that while his consultation on how he was going to implement the ballot policy was taking place, he approved the destruction of around 36 estates. And one of those is Reginald House. But of course people have come here today from Southwark, from Lambeth, from all of these estates across the capital where the same thing has been happening. It's also worth mentioning while we're discussing ballots that although my feeling is that Jeremy Corbyn introduced the notion of balloting residents in good faith, what we're seeing with its implementation is that people will only be asked about this at the very beginning of the regeneration process. So what will happen is that councils working with developers will present them with the rosiest picture of how wonderful everything is going to be if they vote for their estate to be regenerated. But it is absolutely certain that when that happens, it will bear little or no relation to what they voted on, because as plans develop, then the developers come in and say we can't make enough profit if we're going to have to provide this and that. So it's really voting for something that isn't going to exist, which I think is very fraudulent, and I think it needs examining closely what the process is here, because I don't think it's a meaningful consultation. I think it's an attempt to claim that people are going to have a say, but which is actually intended to manipulate them into doing whatever it is that the councils and the developers want.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andy. Thanks for talking to us.
You're welcome, Bob. Thanks.